Hi, my name is Jeremy Gonzalez, and this is Teaching Assignment 1 for Religion 330. I've chosen to teach on Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. And before we get to unpacking that small passage, I want to actually provide some context to the passage to try and to really draw out what Paul is communicating here. He says in chapter 2, verse 20, "If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, referring to things that all perish as they are used, according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh." What you notice throughout the letter of Colossians to the church in Colossae is that Paul is addressing a very specific type of teaching, and it's a type of teaching that infiltrated a lot of churches at that time. And in fact, it's a teaching that has been pervasive throughout most of Christian history. And to give a basic summation of what this teaching is, it's what we commonly know as legalism. Legalism is that you have to follow a list of rules. You have to do a certain set amount of things in order to win and earn the good grace of God. This is kind of a wacky way of thinking of earning grace because it completely contradicts the definition of grace. Grace is unmerited favor, which means that you get something you don't deserve. You do nothing to earn it. In fact, Paul writes in the book of Ephesians that it is by grace you have been saved through faith, not of yourself, not by good works, not by anything you've done. It is a gift of God so that no man can boast. And yet there's people who are infiltrating this church who are trying to convince the Colossians that in order to be a good Christian, you have to follow this certain list of rules. And Paul says here in chapter 2, starting in verse 20, and closing out the passage, closing out the chapter, he says that these lists, these rules that these people are teaching you to abide by, they certainly seem wise. They seem like they might have the appearance of religion, but they have no power over the flesh. That's what he says in verse 23. He says, "These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body." So they may seem like, wow, you're really depriving yourself of sin, but they are really of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. He right there dismantles the idea that legalism, a religious system in which you have to do things in order to atone for your sin, has absolutely no power over sin. You can't outdo your sin. You cannot earn God's favor in light of how sinful you are, you and I are. And so that sets up where we're going to go in chapter 3, because in order to combat this, he wants to remind the Christians in Colossae of who they are, their identity in Christ, because their identity is going to affect how they think. However we identify ourselves as, that's typically the filter by which we process information. So if I view myself as a father, that's how I identify. That becomes the filter by which I process information. If I view myself as my occupation, that's how I identify. Then that's typically the filter by which I process information. We can go on and on and on and look at all the many combinations of people, of how people identify themselves, or the different things that people identify themselves as. But the reality is who you are usually determines how you think. And Paul wants to remind the Colossians that they are in Christ, and that ought to affect the way that they think in light of what people are teaching them as far as getting the grace of God. So that brings us to chapter 3, verse 1. He says, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth." If you remember in chapter 2, I had mentioned that Paul writes you have died to the elemental spirits of the world. And then he goes on to talk about the different rules and regulations that have the appearance of wisdom but have no power over the flesh. That's what Paul is talking about here as far as setting our minds. If you're setting your mind on the things that are above, then you shouldn't be looking to the things here on earth in order to earn God's favor. That's a big contrast. When you identify as a Christian, when you are in Christ, you are no longer looking inward to your own self for righteousness. You are now looking to Christ for righteousness. You are setting your mind on the things that are above. You are looking to Him to fulfill you, not on the things on this earth. And then he goes on in verse 3, he says, "For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with Him in glory." This is a brief summation of who the Christian is in light of what Christ has done on the cross. He says, "For you have died." You haven't literally died. That doesn't make any sense. Of course, we're all dying people, but none of us have died. If you're watching this right now, you're still very much alive. What he is saying is that we were united with Christ when Christ went to the cross. We were united in a very specific way, in a way that our sinful self was united with Christ when He went to the cross, to where Christ was able to pay the price, to pay the penalty for all of our sins. We all, in essence, if you are a Christian, if you're in Christ, you went to the cross when Christ went to the cross, because your sinful self was nailed with Him to the cross. And that's why Paul says, "For you have died." You have been united with Christ, which means your old sinful self has died, and now your life is hidden with Christ in God. That's Paul's way of saying that when God now looks at you, He no longer sees you, but rather He sees Christ. It's as if you are hiding in Christ, and when God looks at you, He doesn't see your righteousness. He sees the righteousness of Christ. Which is why it makes absolutely no sense to seek after the things on this earth, to pursue a type of righteousness of our own. Because when God looks at us, He's not going to see righteousness. He's still going to see our filthy wretchedness. But rather, if we set our minds on the things that are above, if we set our minds on Christ and His righteousness, if we seek Him, then God now hides us in Christ. And when He looks at us, He doesn't see our righteousness. He sees Christ's perfect righteousness. And then Paul offers us this hope here in verse 4. He says, "When Christ, who is your life," it's not you who sustains you, it's not you who makes you right, it's Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with Him in glory. And this is the hope that we have. We have died to our sin, because Christ died for us. He was raised again, and now when God looks at us, He doesn't see us, He sees Christ. And now we have a hope and a glory, a hope of glory, of seeing Christ one day. When Christ appears, we also will appear with Him in glory, because we are so united with Him. And that's what it means to set our minds on things that are above. It's not to seek a righteousness of our own, but rather to seek the righteousness of Christ. And so I hope that this is an encouraging word to you, that if you are struggling with approval before God, this can set your mind at ease, knowing that you are approved by God, if indeed you are in Christ, because your life is hidden with Christ in God. God bless.